Welcome back to Think Global, Do Justice. I'm Phil Dark, your host, and with me is my brother, my co-host, Brandon Stiver. Thanks for engaging what we're doing on this podcast, and particularly these episodes where we're really digging into some current events and things that are going on right now and how they're impacting us in all that we do locally and globally. So, Brandon, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I'm in a different environment, as you could see.
Yeah.
It's July. We're house sitting, which our friend's house is like an hour, or sorry, less than a mile from our house. So we're able to do some construction. Their house is ginormous. I think I could fit 5, 6, or 7 of my houses inside of theirs.
Nice.
So friends from church, we're just living the life over here.
Yeah, you're not in an attic.
I'm not in an attic. I'm in an
That's
air-conditioned bedroom.
Yes.
So
You just have to say that since we don't have video, so people need to just imagine where you are right now.
Right.
And there it is. So,
maybe I will put this on video. Who knows?
yeah, why not? Why not?
I probably can. We switched our platforms, so maybe I'll start doing that. Anyways.
Then
But-
they'll know it's you and not AI-generated voice of you.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well, AI is taking over, so maybe it is.
That's true.
You can never trust things these days.
That's true.
I heard a lot of conspiracy theories this morning, so that was interesting. A lot of stuff about plasma, eschatology, a lot of stuff. So maybe I am AI, maybe you're AI, maybe we'll have to prove that we're not. But one person I know who's not AI, because I've been with her in person multiple times, as you are aware, Phil, we have a few episodes this summer that are sponsored by our friends at the Christian Alliance for Orphans. So for our 3+1 episode, I wanted to have a bona fide orphan care leader with us, and I thought no one better than one Mrs. Kristen Lowry from Shelter Yetu in Kenya. Kristen, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, our listeners will remember Kristen from an episode we did last year talking about mobilizing the church for care reform. Kristen is a missionary affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention and is doing really important work in Kenya, not only in terms of direct services at Shelter Yetu, but also in terms of advocating within Southern Baptist circles for more ethical orphan care and promoting family care for orphans and vulnerable children. So a great person to have on. Kristen, catch us up a little bit. How are things going in your neck of the woods?
Oh wow. So it's winter here. Got a fire roaring and some hot tea, which is nice actually. Kenya's been having some protests for the last month, so that's been difficult and interesting. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're actually going to be talking about Kenya next week as well, because we have Steve Karithi coming on the show. He's from Hope's Promise. And there's all sorts of stuff going on in Kenya these days. So I guess we talked about Uganda last episode, Kenya today, well, maybe a little bit, and then Kenya next time as well. So good to have you jump in. I want to do a couple shout outs. As we like to do in these episodes. And one shout out, Phil, you remember that time that we did that collaboration with the Backstreet Boys? Do you remember that?
I'm vaguely remembering something, but I want you to refresh my memory.
Are you really? Oh, okay.
Yes.
So here's the funny thing. So as some of our listeners are aware, if you go back into the annals of Think Orphan, Think Global, Do Justice, there's all these ads that have been added now, and that's just something. So our show is big enough to qualify for running ads and small enough that it doesn't really make a difference. So the funny thing is, the first time I put them on, I was like, okay, let's just see. I'm just going to put them at the end of the show. And as soon as like the outro music went on, it was a Tide commercial with the Backstreet Boys in it. Have you guys heard that one? And I was like, well, this is different. Okay. So we just got done talking about like global mission and God's heart for justice. And then it's like, and now you can buy Tide with the Backstreet Boys. So anyways, full acknowledgement. We did turn those on to help pay the bills and keep the lights on. But what's much better than us doing collabs where some random advertising firm just inserts stuff is when we get actual sponsors and people that just say, hey, we believe in this podcast, we believe in this community. So definitely want to acknowledge Christian Alliance for Orphans. The summit's coming up you guys will be there, right? You're always there, right, Phil?
I'll be there. I will be there. I'm speaking. I'm going to be still doing that, the SimLab MC as well. And then I have another breakout on building resilience in vulnerable children through sport, play, and fitness. We're using sport, play, and fitness. So, yeah. So it'll be a really fun. It will be fun because we're going to actually have some interactive experiential learning as well in there. So,
well, you've been around the block.
Going to be at CAFO. Come and check it out. I'd love to see you there and have some experiential learning together. That's the beauty of teaching that session is I get to learn too. So
you've been around the block a few times. They should let you Grand Marshal now.
Well,
CAFO.
I was gonna say what I'm gonna say now is more important than that, and that's if you don't want tied ads with the Backstreet Boys. Help out you don't have to even do an ad. You can just say, hey, man, we want to support this podcast because it's been something over the last 250 episodes that has helped me, has helped others, and on that note, share it with others too. Get it out to more people because if this is helping you, no doubt it will help others, and that's what I say to a lot of people. That's how we think about it. We pass on like revisionist history or some other random things that aren't people that we know, and they're not helping change the world, little parts of the world anyway, like this stuff is. So, take a step back and go, why don't we? We don't have the production value of those because we don't have the production dollars of those.
Right.
And that's just the reality. That being said, the impact that this podcast has had is pretty amazing.
It's pretty cool.
Over the years. So
anyway,
so that's something. I'm glad you mentioned that. And on that note, I was just at a wedding a week ago, and I was really disappointed. They're like, "Now we're gonna get to the '90s, folks. We got the '90s music for all you '90s people out there." And I was all, "Yeah, we're gonna get some good music now." And it was the Backstreet Boys. I'm like, seriously,
that's
is
fine.
What you're saying is the '90s music.
I love the Backstreet Boys.
I am a little disappointed that you just said that, but that's okay. I still love you.
All right.
Kristen,
I was
you, hoping
Kristen,
for
you break the
some
tie.
other,
Backstreet Boys, yes or no?
Other good stuff.
Kristen, Backstreet Boys, thumbs up, thumbs down.
She's thinking.
Sorry, my internet just went out for a moment. My
Kenyan moment.
Is related to the Backstreet Boys this year. So we've been listening to quite a bit, actually.
You're actually passing it along to the next generation.
I stand corrected, folks.
You are outnumbered.
That was the one. The dance floor was excited about it. I just was not a fan of the Backstreet. Maybe because I was out of college in the late '90s.
That's all it is.
Maybe that
Kristen
and
I were born in the '80s. You were born in the '70s. That's all it is.
You were still in your single digits when the Backstreet Boys were coming out. So maybe that's what it was.
All right. Here we go.
I'm just an old man. I turned 50 in like 3 weeks, bro. When this comes out, I'm going to be within like couple weeks of being the 5-0, which is like super old.
Right.
Super old.
Well,
unless you're a prepresidential candidate, and then it's not super old. So.
Well, that's changing too. Definitely.
Right in front of our eyes, things are changing as we talk about, folks.
All the time.
We're not going to get into that in depth. You can go to other podcasts to hear about the absolute chaos of the United States right now. Kristen's like, I'm out. I'm in Kenya. I'm hanging out. I don't need to worry about all the chaos that's going on around us.
They have their own chaos, though. They have their own chaos.
It's different chaos. It's different pickup. But, it's absolutely insane. But one of the things we are talking about is some. I mean, the things we're talking about are all recent news.
Right.
But
we're gonna jump into.
But we want to address it to say, hey, look, it's going on. We're not ignoring it. And there's a lot of insanity going on right now that we really cannot predict what's going to happen in the next week, let alone the next month or 2 months or 3 months.
Right.
So.
Here's the big thing, and if this doesn't hit the airwaves in a week, here's the big thing: trust in God.
Okay? 100%.
Just trust in God.
I said that to the kids. I said that to the kids today or yesterday. I was like, hey guys, it's so good that we know who's king, and what happens in the end. Like, because all this stuff, none of it's our Savior. None of it will matter in the eternal perspective. So accept what we do to encourage people, share the gospel, and help them know who their true King and Lord and Savior is. And that's what it was a short conversation with the kids, but it was one that hopefully they're hearing, and then we're not freaking out about all this, but know that hey, this all is gonna it'll be a vapor, and it'll be a blip in the it won't even be a blip in the eternal perspective. So.
I agree.
Anyway,
okay,
100% agree, bro. Now let's get to it. What are we doing?
Yeah, we're doing our 3+1 episode. So really quick, if You got something in that drink today, man. You're ready to go. You're ready and rearing. We got, if you guys,
stuff, bro.
It is important stuff. If you guys, so Phil mentioned sharing it. Want to give a shout out? We say anybody that shouts us out, we want to shout you out too. So like and review us. El Peruano 1784. I don't think that's a year that this Peruvian was born. A diamond in the rough. Add this podcast to your rotation. So thank you for that review. We got other reviews, especially after that episode with Dr. Ruth Padilla DeBorst. Definitely. And if you want to support the show, reach out, Brandon at canopy.international, or you could text me. I'm going to do a Bob Goff and just give my number, 805-235-6856. Hit us up. We love being a part of this community. Let's get into our 3+1. So we got 3 recent news articles. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have heard of, and then 1 recommendation. So we always bring in a friend and a colleague. So Kristen, thanks for jumping in. We're going to go to Phil's first. Phil, what do you got for us? What article are you looking at? What news piece are you following?
Yeah, speaking of chaos and craziness going on, I have this article on the Crowdstrike lack of updating. It's pretty crazy. It's a BBC article that says it's entitled "How a Single IT Update Caused Global Havoc." Right, and we all see these updates and we're like, oh, I don't need to worry about it. It's fine. It's not a big deal. I'll just wait, till the things are worked out and all the glitches are worked out. Then we're going to do it. Well, apparently Microsoft needed to do this update, and it needed to be done. It was a third-party provider, and apparently CrowdStrike. We haven't heard of it. This article actually talks about this. It says you may have never heard of the antivirus firm CrowdStrike before, but something it did to its virus scanner Falcon had a very adverse effect on the computers running Windows software in their millions. And so, as we were talking about beforehand, if you're running on a Mac and you're doing the iOS atmosphere, it didn't affect you at all. And not to say go get a Mac. That's not it. It's just saying that's the reality. And most of these. But the problem is, most major businesses, the flight industry, all of that does not run on Mac. It's running on these Windows operating systems. So it did shut down there was actually I don't know if you guys saw it. It was a time-lapse video of the U.S. flight, all the flights over the course of that, and it went from just the entire yellow planes of the entire U.S. to like just a few. I mean, it had like memories back to 9/11. It was eerie, right? And that's just over a computer lack of update, a proper update. And the scary thing, here is part of it. I mean, not scary, but it's like we talked about, guys and girls, we know that. But the crazy thing about this is how reliant Microsoft is on these third-party providers. So like Microsoft even deflected responsibility to them, which is crazy from a leadership standpoint. It's like, take some responsibility. Like you gotta be on it too, but they issued a fix, whatever. But one of the things that it says, and this is what I want to kind of focus on, not the ins and outs of it. I'm not going to pretend to have IT knowledge to know exactly what happened and what it was and all that. That's really irrelevant to the fact to what I want to really talk about here. And that's this paragraph in the article that says, it is a poignant reminder of how reliant the world has become on devices managed remotely by huge companies and how powerless it leaves us when they fail. Right? So if a big company wants to just shut down the world, they cannot update. And I'm not saying it was intentional. That's not at all what I'm saying. But like theoretically, that could happen. Right? We have no power over that. Whatever. There's actually a book that I just read by Carr. I'm blanking on his first name. I just said it. Jack Carr. It's called Red Sky Morning. Total fictional book, but it talks about like the grid and the IT and the power of people who are in control of the IT world and of our computers. Like literally, they could take out a server farm and everything's gone. And now that's very, very, very unlikely to happen. It's talking about low satellite, all these other things. But it was interesting. I just finished this book, and then I pulled up this article, and I was like, interesting that this happened right after I finished the book, and the book just came out. But, it goes into all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah.
But this talks about just this idea of, and the other interesting part of it was, and again, this goes to just global geopolitics more than anything, but China doesn't run on Microsoft either. So really the only major country that was pretty much not impacted by this at all, or very, very small amounts, was China, which is interesting because, right, I mean, when you look at all the geopolitics going on with China right now and Taiwan and all these other things, it's like, man, but more importantly for everyone that's probably listening to this, because that's not what this podcast is about, for the most part. I mean, it obviously affects us, but just think about if our organizations that we run or that we're a part of are very dependent and reliant on the internet, whether it's Zoom, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's email, texting, whatever it may be. That is all dependent on things that are out of our control. They talk about marketing. They say own your real estate on the internet, right? Which is websites and stuff. But even that is out of your control at some level because there's someone hosting it, right? So at the end of the day, we don't really own anything on this, which is something that I'm speaking to the extent of, I think it's more and more important of having the leadership on the ground wherever we are working to be as self-reliant as possible, to be able to make decisions. And we're not making decisions from remote places, because at some point, even internet outages, you talked about it here, my internet went out. That happens all the time, right, when we're talking on these things. So what happens if there's an internet outage of 4 days and major things are happening and the people are just impotent to do anything during that time?
Yeah.
So that's what I thought that this really brought to the fore in a real way. That is one of those things that people are like, oh yeah, but that won't happen, the grid, that's just people that are doomsdayers and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, if an update can cause this havoc, imagine if someone comes in that actually does have ill motives. What could they do? We're in a crazy world right now.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think the main thing is when it comes to technology, we have to recognize that the door swings both ways. So we can be like, look at this technological advance, and then once we rely on it, it can become faulty, which is what this was. It was a faulty update. My wife works at a hospital, and for the first time in like decades, all these nurses are having to chart by paper, because they weren't accustomed to that. Hospitals often run on Windows. So, it's like one of those things when I think about technology, obviously Andy Crouch, when he talks about like technology isn't just what you can make, like technology, we can think about it in terms of like, oh, this made this new thing possible, but at the same time, it makes other things impossible, right? So we can look at flights and be like, well, now we can fly, all the way over there, but now we're reliant on it. So, oh, well, now I can't make that meeting, or, that trip got canceled, or what have you. Like, there's always kind of like this exchange. Like, once we rely on a new technology, it makes other things impossible. So Andy Crouch in Culture Making talks about how you can no longer, you used to be able to ride a horse from New York to Philadelphia. Can't do that anymore. Why? Because of technology, right? Because we have relied on interstates and cars and all of these things that have now made previous possibilities defunct and impossible, right?
Yep.
So for us, living in a globalized society, to have this, like all this great capability, it can also be undone, and we can actually be potentially worse off. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the cybersecurity piece. I was at a global development conference down in Portland, Oregon that they hold annually called Global PDX. And I was in a workshop on cybersecurity, and it was astounding. It was astounding, that type of apparatus that has to be developed to just protect our energy grids and all of this, and how you can, even intentionally, a bad actor from the outside can actually do something that causes mass harm, just by tapping into this system. Yeah. So it's pretty crazy. Kristen, did this outage last week, did it hit you guys? Did it affect you guys? Or are you guys just so off the grid it was not even a thing?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Is my husband makes fun of me saying I'm in my like pioneer woman era, because we've got a garden and some chickens and thinking about some goats. And it really didn't affect me a lot. And I think that's probably true of a lot of people in Africa. We have a lot of subsistence farmers, and but I am very guilty of being incredibly reliant on technology. And I think when I moved to Kenya as a young adult, I didn't know how to do anything. And Africa has taught me how to be a bit more self-reliant, I think, than I would have growing, coming of age or being a young adult in the States. But then on the other hand, these protests that are happening in Kenya are happening via Twitter or X, I guess now, and via TikTok. They're Gen Z protesters, and that's the entire communications for this protest movement. And so, like last week, the major telecommunications company went down, and the protests were kind of stalled. We could talk later about whether that's intentional or not intentional or what that was about. But there is, it's important, and it's important for the political movement, for the youth, and for a lot of things happening. So, two sides of the same coin, right?
Well, it's interesting because the technology enables certain connections. So I was following the what you're describing, the protests in. It is interesting that it's actually traditionally a lot of the conflicts within Kenya have been on tribal lines, and that's not the case with this one. It's actually on generational lines, and a lot of that is fed into exactly what you're describing. It's based on how people are connecting with one another. So it's not, Kikuyu over here, Luo over there, or anything like that. It's actually, these are the young people that are connecting with one another, through technology, and they have that issue.
Tribeless, leaderless, and it can do that because of the technology. They keep trying to identify who's the leader, who can we talk to, and there is no leader. It is really a community effort and engagement, which is, it's a first in Kenya.
Yeah, it's interesting. It goes back to a lot of this. You talked about kind of the two sides of the coin. Kevin, I forget his name. It wasn't Kevin, but he was the editor of Wired magazine. He spoke at a Q conference actually in Portland a long time ago. It was actually really the boom of social media, a lot of that stuff. But he was talking about the internet, and everything has its shadow, right? Actually, that was Shane Hibbs who talked about everything has its shadow. And this guy talked about with the internet. He says, look, just because the internet has bad stuff on it, you don't throw it out. Just because something's bad, what we need to do is make it better. This is really a different issue, right? This is everything has its shadow, yes. But this is really an issue of we are depending on things that are completely outside of our control. Completely. Like even social media. We learned Elon Musk just bought it, right? And it changed dramatically from what it was before. Zuckerberg now just came out and said, I've done some things in the past. I'm not doing those things anymore. So it's just showing that they've done things. We don't even know what those things are. He didn't specify. But the thing is, there's things that were done. Right. And we can think about all the things that we think were done based on our background, whatever. But the fact is, they are manipulating the reality that we are living in at some level. The algorithms can do different things, right? And so that's just something that we need to remember. It's not freak out about it and don't ever use it and just get off of it. I think there are great arguments. We talked about the anxious generation and why young kids probably should not be on social media and all those different things. But at the end of the day, it's here to stay. We're not going to get rid of it, but be weary of it, to how much you rely on it in your everyday, because as you talked about, if this goes off, if you're completely off the grid, there's issues with that. And if you're in the midst of it and you're fully dependent on it, there's major issues on that as well. So what does it look like to have that happy medium where you are using it, but you're not letting it use you, and you're able to do things responsibly in your area that, look, if everything kind of goes sideways on this particular platform or particular, technology, we're still okay. We can still function. We're still going to have, an ability to do what God has us to do. Right. So that's just kind of, I think, the lesson to be learned in it is make it the best it can be for you in what you're doing and how you're doing it in the way, what God's called you into, without being fully dependent on it.
Right. I'll probably sound like a classical moderate, which maybe I am, but you don't need to be a Luddite, but you also don't need to be completely absorbed. Find the right balance in between those things and hold them in tension. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. Okay. That was like a 2-for-1 deal, because we talked about Crowdstrike and the outage affecting airports and hospitals and all sorts of other things. and even got a little Kenya in there. So let's go to Kristen. Kristen, you got an education story for us that I thought was pretty interesting. What are you looking at?
Yeah, so the story I'm looking at is from the BBC. It's Zambia made education free, now classrooms are crammed. So it's talking about how a few years ago, Zambia made free education, primary and secondary, and kind of the unintended consequences that that's having as far as like a quote from the story. You need to come early to school because there's a shortage of desks, said 16-year-old pupil Richard Bonda. 2 days ago, I came late and I ended up sitting on the floor. It was so cold. His discomfort encapsulates the problem of the lack of resources and overcrowding that has come as a result of offering free primary and secondary school education here. And for me, just kind of thinking through it in the context of Shelter Yetu and us working with street-connected children, it's kind of a story of unintended consequences. Kenya was an early adopter in Africa of free primary and secondary education, and it's had some really great results. But then there's some other things that, like right now in government schools, people might be one of 70 in a classroom designed for 30 or 40. So yeah, it was interesting to think about practical experience. When I started working with street-connected children, it seemed like a really obvious answer, right? These kids are on the streets because they're not in school, so let's pay their school fees and get them back in school. And we did that for many years. And another unintended consequence is that now that we're trying to help with financial empowerment for those same families, we're finding that the families who've had years of school support are struggling to start small businesses. So this is just a really complex issue. And sometimes I think we come in as Westerners or as donors and think, this is really easy. Why hasn't this been sorted? But then there's all these other issues.
I thought this was interesting because it's like you mentioned, like, oh, this seems like simple, just pay for the school fees. But when what it can do, like in that environment, right? Okay, now you're just paying the school fees, but what it did was just kind of like you almost get like the image of like a snake that has eaten a rodent, and you're just moving that big lump down the line a little bit further, right? So we're just going to put money in and we're just going to kind of keep this thing moving, but you didn't actually, what is the money supposed to go for? The money is supposed to go towards community capacity to actually address what's the community good that we're going for here. So in this case, in Zambia, it's education. Okay, yeah, we want education. That's part of, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is education. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So yes, we all want education. But if we're not actually addressing the capacity to educate and we're just saying, well, we're just going to open it up and just have all the kids come in here, yeah, that's great. There should be free access to all. But now what's actually happening? Well, according to this BBC article, the quality of education has become worse. So it's just kind of like, wow, okay, we opened up the quantity, but we lost some of the quality. What's the actual solution where we can get both? That's kind of what stuck out to me, Phil, what stuck out to you from this?
Yeah, we actually talk about some of these issues, not obviously exactly because we wrote it in 2013 or so, but In Pursuit of Orphan Excellence has some of these issues in the education chapter, right? When you just crowd the classrooms too much, it's not going to work. I mean, I think there was a book, I think it might have been one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, but it talked about the ideal classroom size is about 18 to 24 kids. Because then you have enough to do groups of 6, which is what they recommend doing for different things. And there's enough of them, and there's enough interaction, enough diversity in the classroom that causes great conversations, whatever. Once you get too far above that, it's not able to be, it just can't manage it at the different levels. So, I mean, it really goes back to, a lot of stuff we talk about on this show, which is the unintended consequences of doing different things, right? In this instance, it's, hey, it sounds great. Why wouldn't we just make it free? Education is one of the big issues in our countries. We need these kids educated. There's a few issues with just giving the free education away. One is, will they value it? Will they, if they're not paying anything for it, will they have the buy-in? Will you value it? And that's some people, yes, but some people no. And that's a case-by-case, community-by-community issue. But the bigger issues become, you just have too many kids in there because you can't pay what you need to pay for these teachers to be able. We just know that even in the United States, we can't pay our teachers what they deserve and what they're actually doing. But the other issue is you just don't have enough qualified teachers, and we learned that even in Honduras when we were trying to get teachers for this school, and we could pay them pretty well for the Honduran area we were in. And we just couldn't find qualified teachers because in Honduras, to be a qualified quote-unquote teacher, all you're doing is graduating from high school with an emphasis in education and teaching. And so I'm not saying they can't be, but it really is kind of hit or miss on what you're going to get quality-wise. And so you're trying to say, so from a teacher standpoint, from a too many kids in the classroom standpoint, from a resourcing standpoint, it's just once you start giving it away, someone's got to pay for it. And the governments, as we already know in a lot of these countries, are not the most, there's corruption going on, right? So are they going to actually give that money when we go watch that Poverty Inc. movie, right? A lot of these governments have zero incentive to get people out of poverty because that gives away their power. So you have some of these issues that are going on that are all colliding when you come in and start giving it away wholesale. Now, there are scholarships, there's room for scholarships, there's room for things like that, but then you can kind of, when you have it on a smaller scale, as far as what's being free, you're able to then say, okay, but we're requiring volunteer hours, we're requiring something else that gets that buy-in on a smaller scale. But when you're giving it away wholesale, people are like, I don't have to do anything because everyone's getting it. So there's all kinds of issues that are surrounding it, right?
I think compulsory education is necessary. So even if there is always the kids are going to spend their time doing something, and the reality is there are a lot of kids that are working, and that's how they spend their time. And in some societies, that's normal, right? But it's not a path forward if you actually want to develop the community. So compulsory education is right. When I read this, article, I think to myself, this is the right first step, but you need a more robust approach to actually address the educational needs of children. So that's why I bring up the capacity thing. This is, yes, make it compulsory, yes, make it free, but now you have to invest tax dollars or aid dollars or whatever to actually bolstering the educational capacity of the country and of these communities. Kristen, you talked about how this is approached in Kenya. How similar would you say the dynamic that we read about in this article on Zambia is similar to what you guys have seen in Kenya? And because I can think in Tanzania, overcrowding, poor education, like that was commonplace. It was kind of free, but you always ended up paying something, but it was mostly free, kind of thing. Yeah. How is it in Kenya?
I mean, it's a very similar situation. So it is free, but there are these nominal fees that still kind of exclude the very poorest. Because, okay, you don't have to pay school fees maybe, but you still have to pay for shoes, leather shoes, and you still have to pay for a uniform, and you still have to pay for tuition, and you still have to pay this number of things that still makes it cost prohibitive for the people who probably need it the most, actually. And then with secondary education, the plan was, free secondary day schools. But secondary day schools, there's just not enough of them. And the government hasn't been able to fulfill its commitment in funding students in secondary schools. So I looked at some statistics, and there's been some pretty significant improvements in things like delayed marriage or delayed first child. Dropout rates have reduced. But there's still all of those same challenges that Zambia is facing as well that are here. And I mean, in my work with shelter, that it becomes very stark when we find kids on the streets or when we're working within the community. Kids out of school almost always means they're almost in the streets or headed to early marriage.
Right.
Yeah. And Brandon, you made a point about, and I think it's true, like in the U.S., obviously, we have public school, public education. It's an option everywhere, but we have the infrastructure for that, right? We have the tax system. We are paying, people are, again, like I said, someone's got to pay for it, right? So we pay taxes into that. We pay local taxes. We have federal taxes. We have state taxes. We have all these different things that are going into our schools. On top of that, we have the superintendents. We have state board of education. We have local boards of education. And it goes down. We have county and then local school boards that are actually overseeing it at some level, at an elected level. a lot of these countries don't have anything resembling that. So there is absolutely no oversight over what's actually happening in these schools. And I think that's a lot of the issue that, or if they do have it, there's a lot of corruption that's coming from top down that trickles down all the way. And so it's not about the kids, it's about a lot of money. And to your point, Kristen, too, that idea of those kids who can't afford the school shoes and the school uniforms and books or whatever else they're having to pay for. And that was a lot of the case in Honduras as well. It's like a $40 a year or whatever. Those same families are the ones where the kids are most likely to be working because they're so desperate. They need their 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds to be working in the community doing different things. So they'd rather send them to, and we saw this even when it was free school. When they turned, got outside of elementary school and they were 12, 13, they were working because they were a lot more valuable to the family from a monetary standpoint to work than they would have been in school in their mind, because it's short-term mentality. They don't have that long-term focus. Yeah. So there's so many issues. It's what we talk about all the time on the show, right? There's so much nuance. There's so many issues. Once you solve one, there's a whole slew of them behind that one issue that you just solved.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great example of that.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you have to have a multi-pronged approach where, yes, you change the policy, which is what we see in Zambia, but you also address the capacity, the infrastructure, as I was saying, as you're saying now, Phil. And that takes a lot of coordination across the community and across the government in order to do that. And corruption can be an issue. We talked about corruption in Kenya. You mentioned it just now, and I will jump into my story. So also has a piece, well, depending, I guess, on who you believe, of corruption in this as well. So Muhammad Yunus, he is a Nobel Laureate. Many people will be familiar with the Grameen Bank. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in the early 2000s, and he really was a grandfather, if you will, or maybe just say father. I don't know. He's old now, so I want to say grandfather, but he really kind of sparked the microfinance revolution, and within Bangladesh is widely revered. And while some people will pan microfinance, Muhammad Yunus is certainly somebody that kind of stands out. Well, here's the thing. The Grameen Bank, really revolutionary. A lot of people, including people that we've had on this show, have that as kind of their microfinance heritage. Well, in January, Yunus was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. So I'm reading from an article from The Guardian, along with 3 other people for violating labor laws at Grameen Telecom, the not-for-profit company he founded in '83. He is now on bail, but he's been charged with more than 100 other crimes, all of which he denies. Can you guys imagine somebody who's been, we had, I guess, a former president be charged with multiple crimes, but 100? Like, that seems kind of seems insane for a Nobel Peace winner. Kind of wild. So he remarks, "This thing continues to make my life miserable. I can't concentrate on anything because I'm busy digging up documents to prove that I didn't do this. Documents to prove that I never did that." Documents. This always comes up when we talk about working with the authorities in one way or the other. We always had to keep our documents straight when we lived overseas. So he, as I had mentioned, in 1976, he piloted a group of women in Bangladeshi village who were given small loans without needing collateral. By the mid-2000s, it was seen as a key tool for ending poverty. Yunus and the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in 2006. Now, in 2011, he was forced to resign from Grameen after a campaign led by Bangladeshi politicians. Yunus, who was 70 at the time, was deemed too old to run the bank. He maintains the mandatory retirement age of 60 should not have applied to him, as the bank was not a government institution. So there's just kind of all these different dynamics that are kind of woven into this, but it's interesting because we've been talking about how we have influential figures in the U.S. that are a bit older. He was working for a non-for-profit, though, and was kind of forced out. So these these issues have kind of continued to follow him even after he brought so much to the country. So despite the threat of imprisonment now, the 83-year-old has remained in Bangladesh and is still working to eliminate poverty and unemployment. He said other countries had offered to host him, but he did not want to leave behind his work or his employees. This will all be forgotten, removed, destroyed. I don't want to see that, he said. So anyways, it was just kind of interesting when I was going through The Guardian and I saw his name. I was like, oh yeah, Muhammad Yunus. Like, this is big time, like Nobel Peace Prize winner, the father of microfinance, and to kind of see that even corruption has kind of caught up with him. I doubt you guys have been following the story, but the thing that it kind of makes me wonder is what leads to this? Like, we see these Nobel Peace Prize winners that have these issues with their countries of origin, and yeah, just I don't know. Anything kind of stick out to you guys? I think what I'm trying to process is you have these people that are actually doing good, but then you have people that are actively working against them in a way that just seems wholly unnecessary. Like 100 crimes charged against him. I don't know. What kind of jumps out at you guys, Phil? Anything that kind of sticks out to you?
My thing is, it's absolute, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, right? And I would add to that, money and power corrupt. Money and power are absolute, lots of money and absolute power corrupt a lot, and absolutely. And that's just the reality. When money gets involved, things get weird. That goes for family. That goes for governments. That goes for organizations. That goes for people on the ground. That working in different parts of the world. That goes for a lot of things. When a lot of money starts coming in, things get weird. People start fighting. People get disappointed. People are upset at each other. When there's not as much money, you don't see the same issues. There's always issues in these things. But once you have a lot of money coming in to anything, the most benign, the most altruistic organization has to have major protections in place to protect against our depravity of man, right? Now, I don't know exactly what's going on with all this, right? I mean, obviously there's, the government might have ulterior motives. All these things might be going on. I don't know. It's another country. I haven't been following it at all. But I will say, there are examples of people doing this, over the last, over all of history, right? So it's not a new issue. What makes people do different things? I don't know. But I look at it and go, the thoughts that go through my head, if I acted on some of them, I'd probably be in big trouble too, right? And, I assume I'm not alone there. Maybe I am. Maybe you guys are much better people than I am. But, sometimes we have thoughts that are like, man, and I think that's what Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, right? That idea of, hey, look, it was said, don't murder, but if you are angry at your brother, you've committed murder in your head, right? Like, that's the type of stuff you think about. Like, I take a lot of, solace in that. Like, I'm like, okay, if Jesus is talking about it, it's not just me, right? But that's scary from the standpoint of with ourselves when we see these stories of, man, this guy, look at all the good that's been done, but either he's been corrupted or, it's a false, accusations. But whatever the case, there's something going on behind the scenes. There's something going on that has been done, and there's also a lot of other people. If this one is not true, then there's a million of other examples that are. So I look at it and go, we have to, if we want to protect against it in our organizations, if we want to protect against it in our cultures, we need to have, create protections from ourselves. Because I say every government could be great, but for people. Right? Every organization could be incredible, but for people. And you look at even organizations like, World Vision, Compassion, there's been issues that people have had major issues with some of their decisions and some of the things that they've done. Now, fortunately, neither of those organizations have had any major scandals or anything like that, and I pray that continues. But I imagine it's because they have incredible protections in place within their organizations to protect against that, financially, and as well as culturally as well as spiritually. So
Yeah.
that's what I think.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting. It's worth following. I just kind of have this, when you hear 100, this is an elderly man who's won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they're like 100 crimes against him. Like that just, like it doesn't smell right. It doesn't seem right. And it just kind of makes me, when we talk about, hey, we want to see communities develop, and you have, such a history, and nobody's perfect. I don't know, all the ins and outs of the story necessarily, but it's just kind of intriguing when we kind of kick against the good work that's been done. Anyways, I'm thinking through. So this is, corruption. That's what it's being claimed to be, appears to be. We've talked about it already. I think looking at the time here, we also have a recommendation, and it's actually Kristen bringing it, and maybe that is a component there as well. So, Kristen, what's the recommendation for this month?
Yeah, so with all of the things going on in Kenya, I pulled out an old book from 2009 called It's Our Turn to Eat, the story of a Kenyan whistleblower. And it's a super interesting, it reads like a novel, but it's a story of John Githongo, who back in 2003 was appointed as the anti-corruption minister and ended up having to flee the country for whistleblowing on some major scandals. And so it goes all the way back to the colonial rule and how tribes were pitted against each other, and how that has kind of played out, and how the government works in Kenya, and I would say in much of sub-Saharan Africa today. So super interesting book. I do recommend it.
What's the name of it again? Say it one more time.
It's called It's Our Turn to Eat.
Okay. So this is really fascinating to me, because when we talk about international development, or when we talk about what does it look like for a country to come up? One charge that is so common, and I mean, this has even been articulated on this show, is, well, what about the corruption? What about the corruption? And, what you're describing is that this guy was actually specifically, put in that position to work against corruption, but when he actually did his job, he had to flee. That's like a sad reality. It does make you kind of wonder, and I see this at different times with any country in any area of the world, where it says, oh, okay, well, we're working against corruption, but sometimes it could just be like a figurehead. Like, I don't know if that, you can tell me, like, in this story, does it become clear at some point that, like, oh, you were actually just supposed to act like you are. You weren't actually supposed to work against corruption. Like, is that a component?
I think the answer's a bit in the title. So It's Our Turn to Eat is kind of that all of these, all of the parties, all of the leaders that have come out in much of the world say, like, we are against corruption. We don't want corruption. And I think they're probably genuine at some point in saying that. But then when they get into power, there's so many people who are on their side and say, well, now it's our turn. Like, all the people before us got the benefits. We can't not have the benefits. And so I think, I mean, that's what happened with him. I think, unfortunately, that's what continues to happen with a lot of countries, especially those who kind of are living the legacy of imperialism and colonialism on the continent, which is really sad. And I mean, just on a more upbeat note, the protests that are happening now in Kenya, that's what they're pushing against. So they started out with a finance bill that was here that seemed punitive, but even once that was gone, the cries are that we don't want corruption anymore from the younger generation. So it's encouraging to see, and it could be a major change.
Yeah, I think what's interesting in going off of what Phil says in terms of how power corrupts, I completely agree. And I think it's easy for us to be disempowered and then to say, like, oh, but when we come into power, we'll be kind and we'll be just and we'll be loving. And we realize, oh, now that I am in power, I actually have this desire, which is what you're describing. It's our turn to eat, right? Now we get to be the big guy. Now we get to be the bully on the block, kind of thing. And that's probably like the frog in the boiling water. It probably just kind of ramps up over time. But it nonetheless happens. And unfortunately, what you often see, you can see this in interpersonal relationships where like the kid that was abused like becomes an abuser as an adult. You can see this at like the broad scale where it's like we were the oppressed minority, but now that we're in charge, we're going to oppress these other people. And it's a sad reality, yeah, it is. And that's why when Christ, as our example, says, I'm going to empty myself of power, like he literally, like he's God, and he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped for, but he emptied himself, right? Even to the point of death on the cross. And it's just like, whoa, that's the example that actually works. So whether we're in political office, like you're describing here in Kenya, or like we can see here, a lot of power grabbing. I mean, we didn't talk about the assassination attempt or Biden dropping out or any of the big stuff right here. But what you see is men and women grasping for power, and that is a fundamentally not a Christian stance, in my opinion. Not that you can't take a spot of authority. Jesus himself had authority, and he taught as one that had authority. But at the same time, he was not grasping after power. And unfortunately, whether it's in Kenya or the US or Bangladesh or whatever, you can have people that are grasping for power, and that is just not a Christian stance. I don't know.
And that's why, Brandon, I was talking about, this is what I will say to kind of my last word is make sure you have protections in place. People protections, actual written policies and procedures protections against yourself. Like if you're the leader of an organization, make sure that you have checks and you have people, in our marriages, we have our spouse to be a check on us, right? In our relationships, we have each other to be on checks on us. And a lot of churches don't have elder boards. And I'm like, what? How do you not have a check within every church? Because there are just the realities of the flesh that we see all throughout Scripture. If we're not protecting against ourselves and our own brokenness, there's probably going to be some issues that are arising because of that. And so that's all I'm going to say. And I know we have them in our organization, and I encourage you, if you don't already have them, to make sure that you get them in there.
Yep. Good word. And reach out to us if you need help towards that end. Kristen, thanks for coming on the show. It was great to have you back on.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the work of the show and have gained a lot from it.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you in the community, Phil. As always, good to see you, bud. And to our listeners, may Almighty God, who created us in his own image, grant us grace to fearlessly contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom and employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of God's holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you, guys. We'll see you on the next episode of Think Global Do Justice, where we will be talking Kenya again. All right. See you guys.